Ruth Daniels adjusted her blazer with precision, a silent ritual before every important meeting. Her reflection in the glass door of Pinnacle First Bank stared back at her with determination. Her face, serene yet firm, belonged to a woman who had worked too hard to let anyone waste her time. Today, a simple financial transaction marked the culmination of years of effort, the final piece of funding for the Franklin Heights development, a community housing project that would transform the neighborhood where she had grown up. This was more than just business. It was a statement of principles. No one had ever given her anything, and she wasn't asking for favors. She simply demanded what she had earned through her own merit. As she pushed open the heavy glass doors, a rush of cold air greeted her. The polished marble reflected the golden light streaming in through the windows, and the echo of her heels resounded with authority in the space. Her stride left no doubt. She belonged there just as much as any other client in that bank. She approached the reception desk with a polite smile. "Good morning. I'm Ruth Daniels. I have a 10 o'clock appointment with Mr. Porter." The receptionist, a young woman with a friendly face, typed her name into the screen. Her expression shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. Ruth had seen that reaction too, many times before. A brief pause, a slight hesitation, a look of recognition followed by barely concealed discomfort. "Let me inform him that you've arrived. Please have a seat, Miss Daniels." Ruth nodded, maintaining her composure, and settled into one of the elegant black leather chairs in the waiting area. She crossed her legs naturally, pulled out her phone, and reviewed her notes. Every document, every financial statement, and every projection had been meticulously prepared. The loan had already been approved by the credit board. This meeting was merely a formality. She glanced up and observed the steady flow of other clients. Some entered and exited quickly, attended to with accommodating smiles and efficiency. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The digital clock on the wall read 10:30 when she decided to return to the reception desk. "Excuse me, I just wanted to confirm if Mr. Porter has been notified of my arrival." The receptionist flinched slightly and began typing again, avoiding her gaze. "Yes, Miss Daniels, he is aware. It's just that he's finishing up some matters. He will. See you shortly." Ruth kept her expression neutral and returned to her seat. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that professionalism was her greatest weapon. But as time stretched on without an answer, her patience started to wear thin. Exactly 11:02 she stood up. This time her voice was firmer. "It has been an hour since my appointment. I would like to know the reason for the delay." The receptionist swallowed hard before picking up the phone. Her conversation was brief, and when she hung up, her voice was even more tense. "Mr. Porter will be with you in just a moment. Another moment, another excuse, another half-hour wasted." Finally, at 11:45, a middle-aged man emerged from his office with a rehearsed smile. His suit was immaculate, his hair perfectly slicked back, his air of superiority unmistakable. Samuel Porter did not rush. He walked with calculated ease, as if his time were more valuable than anyone else's in the room. "Miss Daniels," he said with an empty politeness, "I apologize for the wait. It's been a busy morning." Ruth held his gaze without blinking. "I had an appointment at 10. It's almost noon. I would appreciate it if we could proceed immediately." Porter tilted his head with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Of course. This way." As they walked toward his office, Ruth noticed the exchanged glances among the employees. A silent tension lingered in the air. Some avoided looking at her, others seemed curious, but none dared to intervene. Inside the office, Porter sat down with deliberate slowness, rearranging papers on his desk with feigned indifference. "So, how can I assist you today?" Ruth placed her hands on the table, refusing to play his game. As you know, I'm here to finalize the financing for the Franklin Heights development. All the documents have already been approved. The only thing left is your signature. Porter pretended to review his screen, slowly sliding the cursor over documents he had already examined before. Ah, yes, the Franklin Heights project. Quite an ambitious endeavor. It is, Ruth affirmed, her tone unwavering, but I have met all the requirements. The man intertwined his fingers over his stomach, leaning back slightly. You see, Miss Daniels, these processes take time. I like to personally review everything to ensure that there are no errors. I'm sure you understand. Every word dripped with condescension. This wasn't just bureaucratic delay. It was a deliberate attempt to remind her of her place. Ruth took a deep breath, feeling the heat of indignation rise in her chest. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her upset. Take your time, she responded with calculated calm. I'll wait right here. Porter seemed surprised, but he maintained his empty smile. Minutes turned into an hour. Ruth watched as the man typed leisurely, took unnecessary pauses, and asked irrelevant questions. At 12:45, she had had enough. She stood abruptly, forcing him to look at her. I value professionalism and respect, she said, her voice as serene as it was sharp. And I expect the same from my business partners. Before Porter could respond, a knock at the door interrupted. Them, Mr. Porter, a young employee said nervously. The board members have arrived, and one of them has asked to see Miss Daniels. Porter's face paled slightly. His eyes darted around, trying to process what he had just heard. One of the board members asked for Miss Daniels, he repeated, his voice losing some of its composure. The employee, a young woman with an anxious yet determined expression, nodded. Yes, sir. Mr. Grayson specifically asked for her. For a moment, the silence in the office grew thick. Ruth said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply raised an eyebrow, watching as Porter tried to collect himself, smoothing his tie and adopting his best expression of control. Very well, he finally said, standing up with slightly stiff movements. Let's not keep them waiting. Ruth picked up her bag with elegance and walked out of the office with a firm stride without looking back. She could feel Porter's gaze trailing her, every step of hers echoing against the marble floors as they moved through the bank's grand hall. The balance of power had shifted. She knew it, he knew it, and so did every employee now watching, trying to appear indifferent. As she approached the conference room, its dark wooden door was open, and inside, the murmur of refined conversation filled the air. Ruth recognized the warm, confident tone of Thomas Grayson before she even saw him. Ruth, his voice called out with genuine delight. It's a pleasure to see you again. She entered the room with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. Grayson, a tall man with silver hair and an imposing presence, smiled at her warmly before extending his hand in a formal gesture. But instead of shaking it, Ruth offered him a brief but sincere hug, instantly easing the stiffness in the room. Thomas, it's a pleasure to see you too, she responded naturally. The board members' expressions lit up with curiosity. It was clear this wasn't just another routine meeting. Ruth is one of the brightest minds in real estate development with a social impact, Grayson announced to the others. Her Franklin Heights project is exactly the kind of initiative we should be supporting. The board members exchanged approving looks. Ruth remained composed, but her mind was working fast. She understood the power of connections, and having Grayson's backing meant more than Porter had anticipated. Speaking of him, Porter had entered the meeting room and stood at the periphery, wearing a tense smile. Ruth and I were just finalizing the details of her financing, Porter said, his voice calculatedly nonchalant. A project of this scale, of course, deserves thorough due diligence. Ruth turned slightly to look at him, holding his gaze with neutral composure. "Interesting choice of words," she replied, with the same calm tone she had used before. Grayson tilted his head slightly, sensing the tension. "Ruth, tell me, how has your experience been with this process?" She paused briefly. She could have chosen the diplomatic words she usually used in tense situations, but this time she decided not to soften the truth. "The loan evaluation team has been meticulous and efficient," she said, carefully measuring her tone. "However, the final stage of the process has been unnecessarily slow." The room fell silent for a second too long. "Slow?" Grayson repeated, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Porter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was simply making sure everything was in order." Grayson ignored him. "Ruth, what time was your appointment today?" 10 o'clock sharp," she answered clearly. "And what time is it now?" Ruth glanced at her wristwatch. "Almost 1 in the afternoon." A wave of murmurs rippled through the boardroom. Eyes darted between Porter and Ruth. 3 hours?" asked a middle-aged woman on the board, her disapproval evident. "Why?" Porter opened his mouth, but no excuse seemed sufficient. Grayson exhaled heavily and turned to him. "Samuel, I hope you have a very good explanation for this." The man tried to regain his authoritative demeanor, but it was evident that he was losing control. "I was simply ensuring that protocols were followed," he insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. Grayson shook his head. "That is unacceptable. Ruth is a top-tier client, and her time is just as valuable as ours. Keeping her waiting without justification is, at the very least, disrespectful." Porter clenched his jaw. "That wasn't my intention." "But you did it," Grayson interrupted coldly. "And that has consequences." The silence that followed was deafening. "Ruth," Grayson continued, his tone softening, "on behalf of this institution, I offer you an apology. Not just for the delay, but for the way you were treated. This does not reflect the values of this bank, and I want to ensure that it never happens again." The other board members nodded in agreement. "I appreciate that, Thomas," Ruth said sincerely, "because this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of their background, receives the same level of respect and professionalism." Grayson smiled approvingly. "Absolutely. And to demonstrate our commitment, I will personally ensure that your financing is processed immediately." Porter's eyes widened in disbelief. "But Mr. Grayson, Samuel, the decision has been made," the older man said firmly, putting an end to the discussion. Ruth allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. She had not only won the battle, but had also opened the door to something bigger. When the meeting concluded, she stood up confidently, shook hands with the board members, and left the room with the certainty that this was only the beginning. And, as Porter remained behind, the weight of his defeat heavy on his shoulders, Ruth knew that the true victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever encountered closed doors along their path. As she exited the boardroom, Ruth felt the weight of tension slowly dissipating. The echo of her heels against the bank's marble floors sounded different now. She was no longer the woman forced to wait. She was the one walking out with her head held high and the respect of the board firmly secured. As she moved through the lobby, her eyes met those of several employees who'd been silently observing. Some quickly looked away, while others gave her discreet nods of approval. And among them was Aaron, the young employee who had the courage to speak up at the crucial moment. "Miss Daniels," she murmured almost timidly, stepping closer. Ruth paused and gave her a serene smile. "Thank you for what you did," she said kindly. "Not many people would have spoken up in that situation." Aaron blushed slightly but held her gaze. "It wasn't fair what happened," she said, her voice firmer. "But seeing how you handled it, it was inspiring." Ruth nodded, acknowledging her words. "Remember this, Aaron. Courage isn't always about grand heroic acts. Sometimes it's just about speaking the truth at the right moment. The young woman nodded, and in her expression, Ruth saw more than gratitude. She saw admiration and the beginnings of her own conviction. Ruth continued toward the exit, where Michael, her assistant, was waiting with her phone in hand. "Tell me everything went well, and that we won't have to hold a press conference," he joked. Opening the car door for her, Ruth settled into the passenger seat, exhaling slowly before responding. "The loan is approved," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "And more than that, I think we have something bigger in motion." Michael raised an eyebrow curiously. "What do you mean?" She slid her phone open and began typing a quick message. "I mean, this isn't just about a loan, it's about what it represents. And if there's one thing I learned today, it's that fixing a single issue isn't enough. The entire system needs to change." Michael nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. "So what's next?" Ruth lifted her eyes from her phone and met his gaze with determination. "We're going to make sure no one else has to go through this." The following weeks were a whirlwind. After the meeting with the board, Ruth received a formal invitation to join the bank's Financial Equity Committee. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a real opportunity to transform how institutions treated their clients. When she saw the invitation in her inbox, she didn't hesitate to reply. "I accept, but I won't be alone. I want to bring other voices to the table." Her request was approved without delay, and so began her new role as an advisor on financial inclusion. At her very first meeting with the committee, Ruth made her purpose clear. "I'm not here to talk about diversity in abstract terms," she said, looking each board member in the eye. "I'm here to ensure real change with policies and clear consequences." The committee chairman, a man with a calculating expression, nodded slowly. "We're open to hearing your proposals." Ruth placed both hands on the table, then listened carefully. In the following weeks, Ruth presented a series of initiatives aimed at reforming the way the bank treated its clients. She demanded audits on customer wait times based on demographic profiles. She proposed mandatory training to eliminate unconscious biases among staff. She pushed for a direct hotline for reporting discrimination in banking services. At first, there was resistance. Some executives tried to downplay the issue. Others proposed superficial solutions. But Ruth refused to be intimidated. If this bank wants to be a leader in equity, it can't do it halfway. And little by little, the pressure paid off. Pinnacle First Bank not only approved her loan, but also implemented measures to ensure fair treatment for all clients. And it didn't stop there. Ruth's story reached farther than she had ever imagined. When a financial journalist heard about her case, he wanted to publish it in a major news outlet. At first, Ruth hesitated. She didn't like the idea of being seen as a victim. But then she realized it wasn't about her. It was about everyone who would come after her. "Tell the story," she finally told the journalist, "but make sure the message is clear." The interview was published under the headline, "How One Businesswoman Changed the Rules of Banking," and it quickly went viral. Clients from all over the country began sharing their own experiences with discrimination in financial services. Ruth received emails, messages, and phone calls from people who had gone through the same thing. And in each of them, she found confirmation that she had made the right decision. The impact even reached Pinnacle First Bank's competitors. Other financial institutions started announcing their own policy reviews to prevent similar issues. The spark Ruth had ignited was beginning to turn into a fire. Months later, when Ruth returned to Pinnacle First Bank for a committee meeting, she was greeted by a familiar face at the entrance. Aaron, the young employee who had spoken up that day, was now wearing a new uniform. A different badge gleamed on her lapel. "Customer service manager?" Ruth asked with a smile, pointing at the badge. Aaron nodded proudly. "They promoted me. After everything that happened, the executives asked me to help improve customer service policies. Ruth smiled approvingly. I'm glad to see they made good decisions. Aaron lowered her voice and added, and in case you were wondering, Porter doesn't work here anymore. Ruth raised an eyebrow, not too surprised. Did he resign? Aaron shook her head. He was fired. There were too many complaints about his behavior, and after all the attention this case got, they couldn't ignore it. Ruth nodded calmly. Institutions change when people stop tolerating the unacceptable. Aaron smiled. And when people like you speak up about it, Ruth gave her one last look before walking into the boardroom. She knew this fight wasn't over, but she also knew something else. This time she wasn't alone, and with every step she took, she was paving the way for many more. From a young age, Ruth Daniels had learned that the world didn't always offer the same opportunities to everyone. She grew up in a modest neighborhood where her mother worked double shifts as a nurse to support the family. Her father, a skilled carpenter, spent long hours building furniture and repairing homes in the neighborhood, but had never been able to secure a loan to start his own business. They don't lend money to people like us, her father would say, not with bitterness, but with a resignation Ruth never accepted. At 12 years old, Ruth understood what it meant for her community to be ignored by the banks. One day, she accompanied her mother to a local branch to try to refinance their mortgage. The woman at the counter smiled automatically but quickly rejected the request without even reviewing the documents. Ruth watched her mother nod in silence and thank her as if that response had been expected. But something inside the girl burned with frustration. Why won't they help us? She asked as they walked out. Her mother sighed and stroked her hair. Because they don't believe we can pay them back, no matter how hard we work. That day, Ruth decided that one day she would prove them wrong. Years later, when she was accepted into college on a full scholarship, the first thing she did was call her mother. We're going to change things, Mom. From that moment on, every step she took in her career was driven by the determination to create opportunities for people like her. She didn't just want to build buildings, she wanted to open doors. Franklin Heights wasn't just a real estate project, it was proof that her people deserved more. When Ruth's story was published in national media, it became the center of a much larger conversation. The article titled "The Businesswoman Who Challenged Banking Discrimination and Won" began circulating on social media at an unexpected speed. People from all over the country shared similar experiences: long wait times, unjustified loan denials, unnecessarily complicated processes for certain clients. The same thing happened to me at another bank. They made me wait 2 hours and then told me my profile didn't qualify. Thank you for speaking up about this. It's a real problem, and many people were ignoring it. Why is no one investigating these banking practices? We demand transparency. Even financial journalists and analysts began questioning whether banks were systematically applying discriminatory policies. A news channel contacted her for a live interview. "Ruth, your story has touched thousands of people. What do you think needs to change in the banking system?" She took a deep breath and looked at the camera with determination. "Transparency, accountability, and equitable access," she replied. "It's not enough to say there's no discrimination. It has to be proven through actions." Her calm yet firm tone made the clip of her interview go viral. The following days were chaotic. Companies, banks, and politicians began speaking out about the need to review financing policies. Community groups organized to demand audits of banking practices. Want more content like this? Then hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because there's always something new here, and you won't want to miss out. Ruth received hundreds of emails, some with words of gratitude, others with heartbreaking stories of families who had been unjustly denied loans by banks. She read every single one, She knew this conversation couldn't end with just one article. Shortly after joining the bank's Financial Equity Committee, Ruth realized that changing internal policies wasn't enough. "The rules need to change from the top," she said. In a board meeting, "And I want to take this conversation to Congress." Her words caught everyone by surprise. But she already had a plan in motion. She met with legislators, activists, and economic experts to propose a bill requiring banks to publish annual reports on equity and credit access. Her goal was clear. If banks were forced to reveal their data, they wouldn't be able to hide inequalities. The media began closely following the initiative. Could the financial system truly become transparent? One day, while reviewing documents in her office, she received an unexpected call. "Miss Daniels, I'm the director of the Department of Banking Oversight. We've been following your work and believe we need your perspective in our new Financial Reform Commission." Ruth remained silent for a moment. She had started this journey by confronting a simple injustice at a bank branch. Now, her work was being recognized on a national level. She took a deep breath before responding. "I accept, but I want to make sure this isn't just a discussion. I want to see real change." Weeks later, when she visited Franklin Heights, the project she had fought so hard to finance, she saw families moving into their new homes, children running through the Central Park, people smiling as they received their keys. Aaron, the young woman who had been promoted at the bank, walked up to greet her. "You know what's incredible?" Aaron said with a smile. "More people from this neighborhood are getting financing now. They're no longer being rejected right away." Ruth looked at the buildings, the lively streets, and knew that everything had been worth it. "Then we're achieving the change we wanted." Aaron nodded. "No, you're achieving so much more." Ruth smiled, feeling the warm breeze on her face. She knew her fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt the world was moving in the right direction, and she had no intention of stopping now. If this story inspired you, leave a like to support the channel and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss the next episodes. And tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from every corner of the world where our channel reaches.